Hi, Kevin. Thanks for coming on and talking with me today.
My pleasure, Jake.
So I came across your work through your book, Living Kindness, where you're talking about the Buddhist principle of loving kindness or metta. I guess just for a little bit of background into you, you talk about being a musician around your 30s and then find Buddhism and meditation. Uh,
Mhm.
what what was the path like for you getting into Buddhism, and what I guess is how did this get started for you?
Well, I think I probably always had some kind of a spiritual bent. And to me, music is already like a spiritual thing, you know. It's sort of a magical thing that touches you internally, deeply. And then because I'm, kind of baby boomer generation, there was a lot of that kind of in the air as I was in my late teens and the late 60s, the 70s. There was a lot of meditation around, and it always sounded like something that would be sort of glamorous or exotic or something. I had a pretty. I mean, I think a lot of people who get into meditation have unrealistic ideas of what's going to happen. So I sort of thought I was going to have some kind of like enlightenment or transcendent experience. And so I got into it. And once I got into it, it was just, it was very different, but it was also became more inspiring on a much deeper level because it was really about starting with like a very deep kind of self-examination and then learning to be present. And the Buddhist philosophy I just found so real. It spoke to life as it is, as I had experienced it. And and so I just kind of, it seemed to me like the most important thing I could do.
When you first started meditating, you mentioned a retreat that you had gone to. Did you start doing, like, were you meditating at home first? Were you doing classes or something like that? Or did you start off with a retreat?
Yeah, I started doing transcendental meditation, which TM, pretty well known. It's what the Beatles did, so that was like, oh, if the Beatles did it, that'll be good for me. And that was strictly, yeah, at home. And then when I got interested in Buddhism, which was about 2 years after I started to do TM, I took a class, and I was living in LA at the time, and there was a monk he was an American who had just come back from Sri Lanka, and he started teaching a class. So I would go there and once a week, and that was a great way to get started. I mean, nowadays people start with an app, which is okay too, but it's much more effective to be with someone and be able to speak to someone and even just to feel the kind of presence of a teacher. But it was pretty quick after I took that class. I started that class in probably September of 1980, and then I went on a 5 day retreat over Thanksgiving weekend. So it was like 2 months later, I went on my first retreat. Again, I mean, I sort of had these. I thought, oh, if I go on a retreat, that's going to fix me. I've struggled with depression and anxiety, and it was like, oh, this is going to like make everything better, and I'm going to have some kind of experience. And again, it was like not like that at all. But then what did happen was very compelling. It really opened me up. I, what I often tell people is like, the first week after my first meditation, I cried every day. And I was 30 years old, and I probably hadn't cried since I was like 12. It was, and that's not exact, doesn't sound like good marketing for, oh, yeah, you want to do that. But, it just speaks to how, for one thing, how closed I was emotionally, and then how I started to open up. And that was really, really important for me.
Yeah, I thought that part in the book was interesting when you talk about you went on a retreat and then like you thought it was going to clarify things that you were going to feel better at first, but it said you were kind of disoriented, and it's like
No.
it seems like it almost like you're opening the floodgates, and it's like first like there's a lot to deal with it if you've been bottling things up.
That's right. That's exactly right, Jake. And I think this is one of the things people don't really understand about meditation. It's kind of pitched and marketed these days as a kind of cure-all, like, oh, you don't need therapy, just meditate or whatever. And it's there's much more to it than that. It's like we ought to have like the warnings, like the side effects. You know how okay, this drug can destroy your liver and there's a danger of death. After they're telling you should buy some drug on the TV. Those are the channels that I watch because those are the old people channels. But you might not see those ads. But
I've seen plenty.
you have, yeah. And so we could have that, there's a risk with meditation of touching emotional states that you're not ready to, things that you don't want to feel, or opening yourself to even memories, or, one of the big topics nowadays in the mindfulness world is trauma, and how sometimes when you get very quiet, and you're in meditation, one of the things that happens is that you're releasing the suppressive mechanism on the subconscious, somewhat like what happens in sleep, right? And so what can happen then is that things come up that normally you're sort of in your ordinary consciousness, you're able to kind of keep them down. It's like, oh, I'll just look at my phone, or I'll, go for a run or something. And I'm starting to have a feeling, quick, go to the refrigerator, and we manage to kind of keep a grip on that stuff. But sometimes, and this is not a daily experience for people, but it does happen. Sometimes things bubble up that become quite challenging. And that's particularly true on retreats, which is why you really need good teachers who understand that and can help you through that. Because ultimately it's valuable to be able to process and integrate those suppressed states, or it could be memories, it could be just emotional wounds that have never been fully integrated or healed. And to be able to let them come up and then start to integrate them into your ordinary consciousness is healing, and helps people to become more, kind of live their lives more fully.
Yeah. How did you go about that, about integrating some of those things?
Hey, I talk a good game, but the reality, I mean, it's it's an interesting question, because you were interested, or what you first encountered of my writing is the only book that I've written that isn't about addiction. So my other books are about Buddhism and the 12 steps, is kind of my brand, if you will, and so when I started practicing meditation, I wasn't sober yet. And it was 5 years after I started, after my first retreat, that I got sober. So, there was a lot of kind of chaos in those years. And really, it was not like a systematic process, and it never is. I mean, I don't think that's the way things really play out in life. We go through experiences that later we can look back and see, oh, this is what was happening. But at the time, it just feels like, you're a ping pong ball, I kind of hit a kind of bottom after I went on a long retreat in 1981, and 3 months, and 6 months after that, I abandoned the whole Buddhist thing and started to follow this New Age guru who was homeless and wanted me to live on faith. And I was doing things like he dropped me off in New Mexico and said, meet me in Boston in 3 days. Dropped me off at the side of the road with my guitar and a rucksack. And I had no money, and I just hitchhiked across the country. So that was insane. thank you. And I only lasted for 2 months, you know. But at the end of that 2 months, I was really homeless because I had left everything I had in Boston. I wound up living on the streets in Venice Beach in California, and sort of getting help from friends, and sleeping in a Volkswagen bus for 6 months, you know. So if you can call that like a process, it was like, you know, it was like I hit bottom. And a lot of that had to do with, I mean, my own makeup, which is I was very unrealistic. You know, I thought I was going to be a rock and roll star, so why do I need to go to school? I dropped out of high school, you know. And so in any case, it took me several years to realize, you know, what I really need to do is just have an ordinary life. And when I got sober, it was like, oh, you know, at some point I was like, maybe a job would be a good thing. And then I was like, well, maybe I should go to school. And I went back to school. And so it took me, you know, probably close to a decade from that, my first retreat, to when I started to have a more integrated life. And that was my 30s, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did that lead into teaching and Buddhism and the 12 steps?
Yeah. Well, as my life started to make more sense, and I started to, you know, have a job and be making a living, and I took up writing, and I was also, I got back into, I will say, my Buddhist practice in a more serious way. And eventually, eventually what happened was that one of my teachers said, will you fill in for me next week, you know, and teach a class? And, you know, I just sort of started to be invited to teach, and I just did that. And then a year after that first invitation, I was invited into a teacher training program by one of the people I had been, you know, practicing with for years. And that's really the way, traditionally, in Buddhism, you become a teacher, is that your teacher recognizes that you've gotten to a certain point where you're ready to pass it on. So the advantage, well, no, the advantage, but the way that plays out is that when I started to teach, which was 96, 97, I'd been practicing for over 15 years, and I'd been on some long retreats. And even though maybe there were some disasters in the past, I had learned a lot from that, and I understood a lot. So, you know, then I had something to pass on, and then especially because fairly quickly I realized that the 12-step world, in which you're supposed to meditate, but there's no instruction or guidance, could really use some guidance from an experienced meditator and from a Buddhist teacher. And so I fairly quickly, within a few years, started to really point my teaching in that direction.
Well, was your focus always the Theravada lineage?
You know, when I started to meditate, I didn't even realize that was what I was doing. Because in those days, they called what we did vipassana, which means insight. And they rarely talked about the Theravada Buddhism. They just sort of talked about vipassana. But that's what I was drawn to, because I did get exposed to Zen and Tibetan Buddhism. And I never was really, I was interested. I thought that was interesting, but I never really felt compelled to like go follow one of those teachers or go on a retreat with those teachers. So yeah, it was always that school that was most interesting to me. And partly that's because that's probably the most secularized version of Buddhism. And it's the one that's sort of most westernized, The other schools tend to bring along more of the cultural, well, I guess I could say baggage, but it's not necessarily baggage, but cultural elements of their Asian traditions. And in the insight, now we call it the insight meditation tradition, it's become much more of a kind of westernized practice. Yeah.
So for that school, my understanding is that the goal is always, what you might call enlightenment. That's kind of a tricky word. It could vary in what that's supposed to mean. How do you think about that and the goal of this work? Like, do you have a certain definition? Is it a feeling that you can't really put in a box with words anyway? Like, what's the way that you think about the goal?
Yeah, it's a really difficult thing to sort out. Certainly the different Buddhist traditions have different versions of what enlightenment means, and I have looked closely at what people say, but it becomes apparent that whatever it is, it's not something that can really be put into words. Yeah. The essence, though, I think, what gives it meaning is that when there is this kind of breakthrough, that some things change internally that are permanently changed, and that's kind of that one, and key to that, particularly there in Theravada Buddhism, they say there's 4 stages of enlightenment, and the first stage, called stream entry, is really the most important one, because it really means you're now on the way, kind of. And the key element of that, there's a few elements, but the key element of it is your relationship to the idea or the sense of I or self. And that through that breakthrough, or with that breakthrough, there is no longer any doubt that self is just a construction, that there is no solid, unique individual. And as much as I've studied and practiced, and as much as I feel like I have a pretty deep and profound understanding of what that means, there's a difference between understanding it and the transformative insight so there's no doubt anymore. And as a recovering alcoholic, I kind of relate it to that when I got sober in June of 1985, there was just a turning. Like, I woke up one day and I was like, I don't want to drink ever again. I have no desire. It's gone. And it was like a transformation that I couldn't, I had thought about it and struggled with it, but I couldn't make that happen. I couldn't, just decide, I'm just never going to drink. It's like, right. Yeah. I'm just, how hard it is to give things up. It's like, but there's a way in which sometimes it's gone, which is another parallel to that. That's people who aren't alcoholics, maybe if they need their own version of this, it's just how when you get older, you don't really, have the same, like, you don't really want to play with blocks anymore. Like, nobody has to say, do not play with blocks, Jake. That's, you need to stop that. No, but I love my blocks. It's like, at one point in your life, you'd be like, oh, my Lego's like the most important thing. And it's like, now you're like 25 and you're like, yeah, no, I don't care. And that's the kind of transformation that happens with enlightenment, as I understand it. There's no self-will involved. It's just an opening, a realization, that's how it is now.
Yeah. Yeah. So speaking of that, what are your thoughts on the text and the scriptures? It seems like it can be easy to wrap yourself up intellectually and and mistake that for the actual thing. But it also seems like that can be a nice way to guide you there. But ultimately, like you're talking about, you have to have this intuitive feeling,
Yeah.
this understanding. So what are your thoughts on the way to use the text? Like you draw on the polycanon for this book.
Yeah.
How do you navigate those?
It's a partnership. And it's something that calls for a balance. There has been a tendency in Western Buddhism to emphasize practice and discount study. Just sort of, oh, well, that's just all more thinking, it's more ideas. But the people that I really respect, and Bhikkhu Bodhi speaks to this. Bhikkhu Bodhi is a famous American Buddhist monk who's one of the great translators of the Pali Canon and the suttas. And it's very true. Like that, what he says is that, if you're meditating and practicing without any understanding of what the Buddha taught, it's kind of like you're just moving around in the dark.
Yeah.
If you're just reading and studying, well, then, you're never going below your neck.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's another comparison that I can use, the light dark idea, but maybe to say it's like, you're blinded by the light. It's just too bright. You can't really see anything. It's just light. But the point is that my experience, and this is probably more useful to say, is that when I practice deeply, and by that, really I mean go on retreats, over time as I practiced and took retreats, the things that I read would be much more meaningful for me. If I read something that's beyond my experience, it's beyond the level of my practice, it might be interesting and I might feel that I have some glimmer as to what it means. But when I practice and then read something, it's like, oh yeah, sure, yeah. And it clarifies my experience. That's the thing. I went on a long retreat this past fall for 6 weeks, and I've been working with a particular practice called the Anapanasati, which is mindfulness of breathing. It's what my next book hopefully will be. And this is a famous, in Buddhist circles, teaching on how to meditate. And it involves 16 different steps that are divided into 4 sections, which parallel the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So, that's like a lot of information, right? But the way it's laid out, it tells you what to do, right? It says, working with your body first, mindfulness of the breath and your body, then being aware of feelings and calming the feelings, calming the body, being aware of mind, concentrating the mind, and then applying all that concentration to insight or reflection on impermanence. So I had always viewed this sutta, this teaching, as a prescription for how to meditate. You should do this, and you should do this, and you should do this, and then you'll have your breakthrough, whatever. On this retreat, as I worked daily, day in and day out, hours and hours of silent meditation, I came to see this sutta as, rather than being descriptive, rather than being prescriptive, that is telling you what to do, as descriptive, that it's actually just describing what happens when you practice meditation on a deep level. So what I'm getting at, to go back to your question, is that because I had studied the sutta deeply, I was able to understand what was happening in my practice in a way I never had before. I'd had all the experiences that are in the sutta before. I kind of knew all those things, but I had never seen that they were all just a natural part of a system. And that's the type of thing that can really then become a very positive feedback loop in your practice. Because now you're sitting and you understand what's going, stuff happens and you're having experiences like, oh, this feeling or that thought or that emotion and this sensation or whatever, or this mind state I'm in. And you can kind of check, oh, where am I at right now? And I can now kind of at any time I'm meditating, I can kind of point to where I am in that 16-step system. That's quite, quite interesting. And I would never have figured that out if I hadn't studied the sutta.
Yeah, that's much more interesting than the way that I usually think about those, because I usually think about them as prescriptions. And to me, I've always been kind of averse to that. So I've always liked systems that or schools of thought that tell me that I don't have to follow prescriptions, because I don't, for some reason, it doesn't, I don't like feeling like I have to follow some kind of step-by-step path. But I like it much better to think about it as that this is something that's kind of describing to you what's happening and helping you understand it. Because it seems like it can be kind of disorienting and confusing. It's like, even if you're doing meditation and you're having these changes in feelings and you're having these thoughts and these different things bubble up, it's like, for me at least, I don't know what to do with it a lot of the time. Like it's nice to have somebody who's knowledgeable about the stuff and is able to articulate it well, to kind of help me make sense of things.
Absolutely. I mean, there's very few people who can develop a really fulsome meditation practice without direct guidance from someone. It's you have to be a sort of spiritual adept to be able to just step into it and do it without guidance.
Yeah. How have you? Do you find that you've more gotten to a place where you kind of just do things your own way, or are there still different I mean, you mentioned the retreat that you went on, but are there still, I guess, books or principles or, I guess, guidance that you like to follow still today?
Absolutely, and that's another part of the kind of evolution of your spiritual path and your growth. Is like all throughout these decades of practice, I've at different times been drawn to different teachers and different teachings, and I very much trusted that. I've never tried to question it particularly, because I think what you want, the most important thing about meditation and a spiritual path is to keep going. There's no perfect or right, wrong thing. You just keep going. I mean, you don't want to get too far off the track, following homeless gurus and hitchhiking across the country on faith. I mean, it had a certain value, but it's not one I would recommend, So be careful who you follow, because we know that there are con men and women out there, big time. But aside from that, just continuing to practice. And so who are you drawn to? Who are you drawn to? So at this point in my life, there's, I'm drawn to monks and nuns in the what's called the Thai forest tradition. So Thailand has a Buddhist tradition where the monks try to live very much like the Buddha did, and they have a distinct style, and it's particularly related to one particular monk, Ajahn Chah, who is pretty famous. That if you know who Jack Kornfield is, Ajahn Chah was his teacher in Thailand. And so I find that school very appealing. It's a it's very much focused on just what's sila, living an ethical, moral life. That's called sila, which is Sila. And it's not so much about like getting enlightened. I mean, they definitely want to get enlightened, but there isn't this sort of dry, like let's go on a 3-year retreat and just meditate 16 hours a day. It's more organic to me. So I love those. I love that tradition, and I have close relationships with a couple of monks in that tradition who I've known for many years. And then the other thing that I'm very drawn to and interested in is the suttas, as you mentioned, which are the earliest recorded teachings in Buddhism. And there are a couple, I mentioned Bhikkhu Bodhi, and one of his students, Venerable Analayo, Bhikkhu Analayo, is a crazy good scholar, a German scholar who translates all not just the Pali, which those scriptures are in, but he also does Chinese and Tibetan, and he's able to look at all the correlations between these different versions of the text, and he's a very, very just a really impressive teacher who keeps kind of pushing the boundaries of what I understand, what a lot of people in my sort of circle of tradition are interested in. So those are, again, it's just those are the things that I'm drawn to. Like there've along the way, there's always been different teachers that I've been drawn to, and that's where I am right now. And I pretty much ignore everybody else. I mean, I don't, because there's all these books that come out and they're just like, they're not for me.
Yeah, it's hard to navigate that, like which one to pick. There's very much like choice anxiety for me, because there's so much. There's so many different, even within Buddhism, like there's so many different lineages, and then there's so many schools of thoughts and interpretations of them.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, first of all, I think it's like just trust what inspires you. If you hear a talk or read something from a teacher that you respond to, just get all their books. You know what I mean? Like, just dive in, and rather than, I should read all these different people. It's like, no. If you find somebody that inspires you, just go with that, and then build from there. Because if you read, one teacher, they'll probably refer to some other teachers, or in the back of their book they'll have references and stuff. So build out from there. Every tradition is going to pitch itself as the best way and the most whatever. I am skeptical of certain of the more I don't know, when they're really flowery and like trying to, like, when there's a lot of sort of mystical elements, they kind of lose me. I want something that's really going to speak to my daily life. That's not just like, that's so inspiring. Yes, I want to go to the Himalayas and live in a cave. It's like, yeah, but like you're in school. Like I teach mindfulness. There's a mindfulness club at UC Berkeley, and I drop in and talk to them and teach them a couple times each semester. They invite me over, and and I just want to speak to them like, okay, how are you dealing with the stress of being a student? And are you enjoying being on this beautiful campus? And, are you being mindful? Are you engaged? How are you holding all this? Rather than, I'm going to teach you a way to transcend it and forget all about it. I mean, like, that doesn't really help you, because when the meditation's over, you still have to go to class. So how are you going to, operate in that? How are you going to work in that?
That also makes a confusing goal too. Like, because if you're striving for that, then that kind of contradicts the rest of the way that you're spending your time. So you're gonna have like this weird like tension where you're probably gonna have to pick one.
It's true. I mean, then you might decide to drop out and move to a monastery. You could do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I know people who have done that, and I mean, and I don't think that's a bad career choice. You know, it's it's really challenging, but I it's not something I could do. I just, I considered it at certain times, and I realized that, oh, the only reason I want to do that is to escape from my life,
That's interesting.
and that's not a good reason to become a monastic. But I do think that the monastic life is one of the. I mean, it's. I respect it tremendously. I think it's maybe the most valuable way to spend your limited time on Earth.
Yeah, I mean, certainly could be. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think touching on what you were just talking about being able to use some of these things in your daily life. That's why for me personally, like the first ones that kind of hooked me were Taoism and Zen for that reason, because it didn't like nobody was telling me that I had to like go and do some of those more extreme things to get a certain outcome. But not like and at first I was like, oh, there's like not really a point in that, but now I'm kind of at a place where it's like you kind of just it kind of seems like you just do whatever resonates with you, whether it takes you down that road or not, but there's no one path that like you have to do.
Well, you're right. Well, fair enough. I, the the limitation in those two traditions is mostly that they don't give you many specifics
Yeah.
about. It's the same thing you encounter if you've ever read any of Eckhart Tolle. He presents these really inspiring ideas, but you're kind of left, well, what do I do with that? And that's one of the things that you can get from Theravada Buddhism that I really appreciate. Particularly, if you study the Noble Eightfold Path, that really gives you guidelines for
Yeah.
how to operate in your life. And I find that really, really helpful, because then it's not just it's not just an attitude, which is kind of what I would say. I mean, it's simplistic, but in a way, it's what
That's fair.
Zen and Taoism are getting at. It's like move through life with this attitude, which is a really, great idea. It's the attitude they're pointing to, the idea of really letting go and being fully present and, equanimous is great. But sometimes we need more specifics. And
Yeah.
there's a book by Bhikkhu Bodhi that I would recommend. It's just called The Noble Eightfold Path. It's a small book. It's like 100 pages long, but it's one I've been studying for several years, and I go back to it because it really it breaks it all down in ways that it's somewhat scholarly. It's not like a chicken soup for the soul type of book by any means, but if you really want to get some nuts and bolts about how to apply the foundation teachings of Buddhism, that's the place to get it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right about the trouble with the lack of detail in Taoism and Zen. I think for me, it's mostly just been a cool starting point of like that's like that idea of kind of just not forcing and doing what feels natural to you. But that also can mean reading these books from these other traditions and then like building more on top of that. Like it's because to some extent it would be forced to like not let yourself do that anyway. So I guess that's if that makes any sense. Like that's kind of the way that I use it.
No, I think that's right. And what the question then, it's like we really need something to start us on the path and to kind of give us some momentum. and sort of a vision. And that's what I think you're getting from that. It's like, oh, right. This isn't just some like thing that's, cool to do, or that is intellectually interesting. It's something that I see that it's pointing to something that really makes sense as a way of living, of just being present, and some of the images in the Tao Te Ching, the water wearing away the rock, and this sort of the long enduring mind, and these ideas that can really be like, okay, that's really, I want that, and so you need that motivation, because it's not easy to take on a path, a spiritual path that is essentially going against everything that the society and culture are telling you. Something that's essentially anti-materialistic. It's kind of fundamentally, anti-ego and anti-self. and sort of, so the whole idea of like social media and promoting yourself and making a lot of money and becoming famous or whatever, all of that is kind of discounted as being like the wrong way. It is not that. It's not easy to decide to do those things. So you need some energies to carry you, some real inspiration to carry you.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate this conversation. And I know I didn't touch a whole lot on the book in this conversation, because I was kind of just interested in picking your brain about some different things and hearing your perspective. But I highly recommend people go check out the book if you're interested, especially in the loving kindness idea or principle or path, however you'd want to call it. But outside of that book, I'll link that book in your website. Outside of that, do you have anything that you'd like to let people know about?
Well, I mentioned maybe before you started recording that I'm going to be teaching a retreat in southeast Indiana. The Tri-State Insight group or something like that invited me, so I'm going to be there like the 4th of July weekend this summer. So if you're fans or locals, you can find me. And that's on my website, kevingriffin.net. So and I have a weekly Zoom class every Tuesday morning. At least it's morning in California, 10 a.m. So 1 p.m. East Coast time. That's just a drop in. People can come in for free and see me.
Cool. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate your time.
Fun to talk with you, Jake. Thanks,
you
man.
too.
Good luck.
Good to meet you.
Take care.